A very good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all. I, Dr. Pallavi Saxena, SSC member of iLEAPS, and Dr. Samina, iLEAPS IPO, welcomes you all in our third episode of iLEAPS Global Colloquium Series. So, within a good response received from episode 1 and episode 2, we have decided to continue this series in 2024 also. We actually started in 2022. So, let me introduce you in a very brief manner about iLEAPS. So, iLEAPS is Integrated Land Ecosystem Atmosphere Interactions Program, which is a global research project of Future Earth. iLEAPS provides understanding of how interacting physical, chemical, and biological processes transport and transform energy and matter through the land atmosphere interface. So the prime purpose of this colloquium is to introduce the scientific community with the distinguished scientists which we have invited from different parts of the world. And it is basically a very good opportunity, especially for early career researchers, to interact with our distinguished speaker and can share the knowledge and ideas through this platform. So our today's speaker is Dr. Harni Nagin, who is Professor and Director of Center for Climate Change and Sustainability at Azim Premji University, Bengaluru, India. Dr. Nagendra is known for her research spanning over 30 years on forest conservation and urban sustainability, with several seminal publications in both areas of work. Her interdisciplinary work on forest combines remote sensing, biodiversity studies, and institutional analysis, and is recognized for elucidating the link between pattern and process in the human-dominated landscapes of South Asia. For her interdisciplinary research and practice, she has received many awards, including the 2009 Cosarelli Prize for the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the 2013 Eleanor Ostrom Senior Scholar Award, and the 2017 Clarivate Web of Science Award. She is an elected member of the World Academy of Sciences, Italy, and the Indian National Science Academy, New Delhi. She has written over 200 academic papers, including recent publications in Nature, Nature Sustainability, and Science, and is on Stanford University's list of the top 2% cited scientists in the world. Professor Harni has been a lead author on the IPCC AR5 reports and a past science committee member of Diversitas and the Global Land Program. She engages with international science and policy through her involvement as a steering committee member of the Future Earth Program for Ecosystem Change and Society and the Future Earth Urban Knowledge Advisory Network. She is on the advisory board of the European Institute of Innovation and Technologies Climate KIC and the WRI Ross Center for Sustainable Cities. So today, she will be talking about building ecologically smart cities in the global south, where she will discuss about the spatial imagination of urban pockets of interconnected by water and vegetation. And she will also discuss about the exposure of some of the cities to some extreme events like heat waves, floods, and droughts. So let me again welcome Professor Harni Nagin to share her views on this very important topic. Professor Harni, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Pallavi and Samina and iLEAPS for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I know we've been wanting to do this for a while, so thank you very much. Samina, I think you might need to make it full screen here on the first slide. This is the second. Yes, thank you. Yeah, a pleasure to be here, like I said, and I'm going to talk about ecological smart cities in India and also in the global south. So the next slide. I'll begin with something that many of you watching this might be familiar with, a nightlight satellite image of the world. And what I want to point out here is the rapid rate of urbanization. You'll see in many parts of the world, especially in the global south, India, China, uh, many parts of Africa, many parts of Latin America, apart from the US and Europe, are increasingly becoming lit up by lights at night as the satellites capture. And that is really an indicator of urbanization. And we're already a world that is more than 50% urban, and the world is in the middle of a very rapid urban transition. So the era of the Anthropocene, which we all know about, is actually the era of the urban. And we are pouring so much cement and concrete into our cities. We're going to become a world that is 75% urban by 2050. But where are these new cities going to come from, or these new urban areas? The next slide. If you look at this map, for instance, of the growth of cities from 1990 to 2014, you will see that the red and the yellow cities, which is the fastest growing cities, are dominated by India, China, and interestingly enough, Nigeria being the third fastest urbanizing country in the world. And you will see the growth rates are 3 to 5% or more than 5%. And India, for instance, is really a hotspot of urban growth. We have 3 of the world's 10 largest cities, and we have 3 of the world's 10 fastest growing cities. And we also have many of the world's now top polluted cities in terms of air pollution. And no surprise, because of the rate at which it's growing, it's very difficult for infrastructure to keep pace with the demand in these kinds of global south contexts. The next slide. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. And so what happens is we get issues like a lot of informal settlements, and you can see the informal settlements in these tin shacks, because all these cities, whether it's you think of the city in Nigeria, so think of Kigali, think of Bangalore, think of Mumbai, think of the city in Latin America, city in Brazil, they're all basically growing because not because it's a planned city with the urban infrastructure, but often because it's shanties of people like this, people moving in from rural areas which are not growing fast enough, where there is climate change hitting, you have a lot of climate refugees. They come in and they live in these very bad conditions, and they are faced with heat island effects, flooding, water pollution, air pollution. And typically the poor are the worst affected because they are the ones which are most marginalized, most exposed to these kinds of infrastructure. And you'll see that nature has a role to play in all of these, because there are no trees, there are heat island effects. Because there are no wetlands, there is flooding. Because we haven't put in the waterways, and we've encroached in all the waterways, and we are throwing in a lot of detergent, you have water pollution. And of course, we have cars which leading to air pollution, and we've not managed our public transport adequately, in which case we would have left trees on the road. The next slide. So if you look at India, it's not just the fact that urbanization is impacting the quality of life in cities, but it's also the fact that its urbanization is a huge impact on the rural landscape around it. So if you think of India in the next 50 years, we're going to be, by 2050, in the next 25 years, we're going to add 400 million urban people. 3 cities alone, in India, the Kolkata, Mumbai, and Delhi will contain more than 100 million people, just those 3 cities within themselves, right? We have done some recent analysis which show that protected areas, 3 times the number of protected areas are going to, than there were 20 years ago, are coming within 50 kilometers of cities. Which means if you have a city right next to a protected area, the city is going to hugely impact the protected area. Our cities are also sucking water from rivers like Kaveri, Ganga, and Yamuna, which means they're drying out and running out of water. They have a rising electricity demand, a rising infrastructure demand, which means more roads, more highways, more buildings, which adds to the impact on nature, not just within the city, but outside the city. And cities, of course, not just suck in waste and suck in water and electricity and food, but they also export a lot of waste and pollution. So unless we think of sustainable cities, we are not going to think of sustainable countries. And that those two are very strongly interlinked, especially in a globalizing world. The next slide. Cities can't survive if they ignore ecology, and nor can India or any global south country which is urbanizing maintain rural well-being unless they actually address urban sustainability. Right? The next slide. So we started with some originally looking at actually some literature on sustainable global south cities, and what we found was global south cities have been growing very fast, For instance, Bangalore, if you look at, it's the conventional story is the market town, which was in 1537 to the tiny polygon, but the ecological history is much older. But also what I want to tell you is we've been working on Bangalore for the past, from 2006 onwards. And we have now a lot of data and papers, about 70 or 80 publications in the different aspects of Bangalore. So I'm going to use Bangalore as a case study. But really, we've been working on Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata, so many other cities in India. And the story is not very different there. And the story is not different for other global south cities. However, we did do an analysis some while ago. And when we were looking at that, we were, I think we missed some slides. Can you just go back? One slide back? Oh, okay, never mind. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, you can skip ahead. So this is from the book Nature in the City, where I'm going to talk about the ecological history of Bangalore. And yeah, you could move ahead. But one of the things we've been seeing is, if you look at the top 1,000 papers in ecological sustainability and in urban sustainability, and we did that analysis in a nature sustainability paper, what you find is that in these cities, essentially, the top maybe 0.5% comes from global south. So if you look at the top cited 1,000 papers over a decade of work on urban sustainability, only 0.5% comes from the global south. 20% comes from China, which is a context of its own. And the remaining 70% comes from the US and Europe. It's a very little that we have, which is context specific, which is relevant to these countries. And therefore, one of the reasons we started all this work is to get some information on how do you actually think of urban sustainability. And there's been a lot of focus on smart cities, but many of these, what we've seen is these cities are so infrastructure poor and so lacking in basic money, because the pace of growth is outstripping the capacity of the cities to provision. They will eventually catch up, but in the meantime, you don't have the capacity, for instance, sewage lines or road infrastructure, or dealing with air pollution, or dealing with public transport. And therefore, what happens is, in a city that is not wired, where many people lack education, many people lack the internet, many people lack basic facilities, you can't have a smart city. What you can have, which fits the Indian ethos very well, or the global south ethos, I would argue, even moving wider than India, is the idea of an ecologically smart city, where you can, because nature is acting as infrastructure. Nature cleans up our water, nature cleans up our air, nature provides people with food. And so through the example of Bangalore, I'm going to talk to you about how we've always been an ecologically smart city, but we're losing that sort of concept of being ecologically smart. The next slide. So if you look at Bangalore, the general idea is that it became a market town in 1537, and this area was barren before that. But it was not barren. It's an unusual old city. It is, we always think of cities as growing in the, as civilizations, ancient civilizations growing next to water, but Bangalore is in the rainshade of the Western Ghats. It gets very little rain. It's a semi-arid area, and there were no perennial sources of water. And yet we have megalithic stone tombs that tell us people were there 2,500, 3,000 years ago. We don't know about those people who are there. They have left a few megalithic stone tombs and other traces, menhirs and other traces of their existence. We also find around the turn between BC and AD a lot of different amphoras of coins, including Roman coins and coins from different parts of the world, which hint at the fact that Bangalore may have been an overland trade center. But again, we don't know anything about how these people lived ecologically. However, from about the 6th century onwards, we start finding stone inscriptions and copper plate inscriptions that give you a sense of how people lived in this landscape, because it's the first written record. And the black is a boundary of Bangalore, of the current municipality boundaries, and overlaid on a digital elevation model. And you can see how undulating the terrain of Bangalore is. So the red is the flat ground, which is where the national park is even now. And you can see that the east of Bangalore is relatively flat, and the west is quite undulating. In fact, they were two ecologically different terrains with biogeographically different terrains. What you have is a watershed, and the hills that you see in the center divide the western part. So in the west, the rainfall actually flows into a river, which is the Kaveri River, which is a tributary of the Kaveri River. And in the east, it flows into a tributary of a different river called the Pen River. Okay, so these are two completely different watersheds. You also find that people initially, when they came in between the 6th and 9th centuries, came in mostly to the east and mostly towards the shallow areas. And that makes sense because they're flat. And they're relatively easy to do agriculture. So you would actually come in here, create a lake or a water body, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, and dig into this depression. So it's a tank, it's a holding tank for water. It holds the rainfall, and that is what makes it an ecologically sustainable place so that you can actually expand human cultivation in this area. The west is far rockier, and it stays, even in the west, you'll see that people are going into the shallow slopes, and that's where they're actually building. The next slide. By the 10th and 12th centuries, the good landscapes have been taken over, so people start moving a little more into the hilly areas, but they're still moving into low elevation areas. You can see largely wherever you see the locations of the inscriptions, they're not in the really rocky terrain. The third slide, the next slide. By the time of the 13th and 14th centuries, the Hoysala dynasty takes over. The Hoysala dynasty are very strong tank builders. And they build these tanks of water. So in fact, if you look at the very first inscription, which is Honga Sandra, the surname, the epithet Sandra is a corruption of the Sanskrit word Samudra, which means large body of water. We think of Samudra as sea, but actually what Samudra means is a large body of water, which tells you that there was a lake. Honga Sandra, there is absolutely no lake now. You see all of these village points now spread across the landscape by the 13th to 14th centuries. But what you will see is, and you will see many more, 16th is Belur Nagasandra, 19 is Mallasandra, 20 is Singasandra, 21 is Suli Kunte. Kunte is a smaller body of water. 23 is Dodda Nekundi. Nekundi is a intermediate body of water. So there were large, medium, small bodies of water, but they were all networked hydrologically because Bangalore is hilly terrain. And what you had is, again, this was something that the Cholas before them and the Hoysalas after these are different dynasties did very well, which is to interlink these networks of reservoirs. So a reservoir that was at a higher elevation, when it got rainfall, would overflow through a sluice gate, and that water would be used for agriculture and cultivation of orchards, as well as it would be diverted down a rainwater channel into the next lake, and then the next lake, and then the next lake. So eventually it would flow out of the city, but it would really recharge a number of different lakes along the way. So no drops of water would be wasted. And there was a lot of rainwater harvesting. And when this water went into the ground, there was a well on the left side and a well on the right side that were then used through the year. And so this, it's not just the landscape. The lakes were shallow, they dried up, they were desilted. The silt was used, fertile silt was used for agriculture. There were fish that thrived in the silt-ridden, low, shallow water. People would walk in and pluck this fish out from the water and eat them. So that was their source of protein. And then when the lake dried completely in the summer, it was used for millet farming, as well as for, just weeds would grow. And these were weeds that people would pick up and either feed the cattle or they would cook with them themselves. Very nutritious weeds. So this entire lake landscape was a three-dimensional landscape of water and food and agriculture and shade, because there were a lot of trees that were around this entire area, right? So this was a very different kind of a landscape organized around its lakes. And this tells us how do people survive in a semi-arid landscape? By protecting and preserving every drop of water, by being very ecologically smart. The next slide. By the 14th to 16th centuries, these are the new villages, and you'll see now new villages come up in the hilly terrain because there's no other place, all the other good places are being taken. But villages are spread across this entire dynasty, across this entire landscape. And that village with its tank network and its agricultural network is what is helping these landscapes thrive by the time the market city is founded in 1537. The next slide. So this is the location of the inscriptions. We also get a lot of hints from the text of the inscriptions about how these landscapes function. And this is a very typical inscription from one of the villages, Kempapura of 1306. But this kind of inscription, which are marked in yellow, are repeated in inscription after inscription. So it's not unique to this landscape. And it talks about, it's a land grant essentially. They have created this village and created this lake. And they're talking about the village having all the agricultural produce that goes from this village to the god, to the temple. And therefore it's a land grant written. But look at the way they define the land grant. We grant with pouring of water because it's sacred as a devadana, that is a contribution to the god, Vileshwara Mudayar, for this village, the tank of the village, and all the wet and dry lands. And look at the three-dimensional imagination. When they talk about the wet and the dry lands, which is the paddy, the wetlands is the irrigated landscape of paddy, and the dry lands is the non-irrigated millets, including the wells underground and the trees overground within their four boundaries. So this is a very different landscape. I mean, think of any survey grant in any modern part of the world today. Who talks about the wells underground and the trees overground within the four boundaries as being part of a land grant or as being part of a survey document? Well, one of the first things, in fact, people do in a city is if you have a well, it's land wasted because you can't build. So across Indian cities, across many global south cities, first thing people do is they fill in the wells. In rural areas, people protect wells, but in cities, people fill in the wells because every square foot of land is valuable. Similarly, if you have a tree is an area where you can't build. So the first thing people would do is cut down the tree and build a house. And then try and figure out how you're going to have air conditioning later to deal with the heat wave. Right? So this three-dimensional landscape was there. It was ecological wisdom. It has disappeared from our lives. The next slide. On the other hand, this was the east. This is a very typical inscription that I told you about from the east. The hills or the Malnad, the landscape of the west, had a very different ecological structure. It was rocks, granite, very thin soil, very not good, not at all fertile. And the ecological use of that landscape was pastoralism. It was a jungle. It had thorny bushes, wild beasts, and the inscriptions are not at all talking about wetlands and drylands and wells. In fact, they talk about hunts. At Kengeri, one of them records the death of Ramadeva, who was killed by a wild boar. They're hero stones, really. From Kanakpura, another place, a death of another person from a tiger attack, of a second person from a tiger attack, and a third person and his dog. So they were hunting dogs who died in a boar hunt. So lots of wild boar and wild tiger attacks. Then there are hero stones describing cattle raids because there were different groups of people from different villages who had cattle. And they fought together, they fought with each other. They were actually cattle raids, but they were talked about as heroic battles. And the stones describe the victors, or in some cases, the people who died as going to heaven, and the opposite side as going down to hell. Right? So again, you get this very different ecological sense of this landscape. And even today, the jungles of the southwest of Bangalore, where these inscriptions are found, are areas of high biodiversity, especially high wildlife diversity within the Bannerghatta National Park. The next slide. But today, this is Bangalore, and I was telling you about the valleys. The Vrishabhavati Valley is the valley that goes to the Kaveri River. The Hebbal and the Koramangala Chalagatta Valley feed into the Pen River, which goes into Tamil Nadu. So these are the two watersheds. This is very easy to see here. I mean that they're geologically different landscapes, but today builders and planners don't consider what was very obvious to Bangalore residents centuries ago. They don't know the difference between the west and the east, and a lot of it is because we have filled in the lakes of the west and filled in the wetlands and built up. So we've raised the landscape and raised the elevation on the east. In the west, we have blasted the rocks and reduced the elevation and again built on it. So we sort of flattened and tried to homogenize a landscape to the point that we've forgotten this ecological underpinnings. Yet, whenever you have environmental stress, for instance, when you have flooding, more flooding is always in the east. When you have drought, more drought is always in the west. And Bangalore is a very strange city which rains in one part of the city and doesn't rain in another part of the city. And the ecological difference really explains this, right? And it's very evident in times of flooding and drought. It's becoming increasingly evident in times of climate change, but it's not something that anybody has a popular imagination of. In fact, we didn't. Before I started the research, I didn't know this. Next slide. So this is the growth of Bangalore, and it's grown very rapidly. You can see almost every period in time, it kind of doubles in area, and the time period of doubling shrinks. So the city has been growing very, very fast. If you can go to the next slide. So I was talking about the inscription stones, and we know that from there, Kempegowda, who was the king who built the city, the founded the modern city in 1537, the market city, not exactly a modern city, but a market city in 1537. We don't have any written notes on how the city was built. We have a lot of myths, but we don't know what was fact and what was myth. We have a lot of stories that survive about this is the way Kempegowda covered the city, but as an ecologist, one looks for facts that are written down somewhere. And there was Shivaji, very well-known king of Maharashtra, part of southern India. His father Shaji became the ruler of Bangalore for a brief time from 1638 to 1670. And his poet Parmanand wrote this poem called Shiva Bharat in 1670, which gives us a sense of how Bangalore looked like when Shaji took over in the 1640s. They call it Bingrul, and you can again see that it's an ecological city. It resounded with content coos of countless pigeons. It was animated by the calls of peafowl. The city teemed with deep lakes. Each house had a well. There were fountains at every square spouting a fine mist. There were home gardens and trees thick with flower and shade. The city was girdled by a bottomless moat shimmering with water and dotted with countless lakes. The Samudra metaphor comes back. Each lake was as big as a sea. Picturesque parks, festooned with creepers swinging gaily in the breeze, all adorned the city. And the king ruled here like the god Indra in his paradise, right? So it was an ecological paradise, and you can clearly see this. So we know that from we have the villages which create this infrastructure for an ecologically smart city. The city comes on top of it. And clearly, Kempegowda and his dynasty preserve it till the point Shahji takes over, because the city is still very beautiful. After that, we lose some information on it till it changes a number. No, you can go. The next slide is right. A number of different rulers take over. But we don't again have a lot of information till there are a number of Anglo-Mysore wars. So the British come into this landscape, and Tipu Sultan, Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, father and son, are rulers of this area. And they fight with the British. The third Anglo-Mysore war, Tipu loses, the Indian king Tipu loses Bangalore briefly to the British for 20 months, and they come and they sketch. So first thing the British do is draw sketches, paintings, and you get a sense of the landscape. And here you can see, I have put the boundaries of the cantonment and the Indian part of the city, but really when the British took over, all that you had was the Pete, that is the Indian part of the city, which is where people live, and the fort. So those two areas to the west. And then there was, the cantonment comes later. It's not there in 1791. I'm just giving you a sense of the geography. But you'll see a lot of lakes, and you will see that a lot of trees also planted either in squares, because these are orchards, or along roadsides in linear stretches. And you get a sense of this dry landscape, and I'll give you, if you can go to the next slide. Here's a painting. So you can see how this landscape looks. Because it's a semi-arid region, it's dry, it's open, it's barren, and you have the botanical garden Lal Bagh, and you can see it in the distance. That is the cypress gardens of Tipu, which later becomes the Lal Bagh Botanical Garden. But you also have barren stones, open areas, and a few trees planted on roadsides and in groves, and sacred trees like you have on these raised platforms. These are all sacred trees that are used for worship. The next slide. By 1888, the city has become a cantonment, become a British city, and the British find Bangalore very hot, so they plant trees. They have access to a palette of trees across the world, and so they plant all of these trees. They also build more and more lakes to provide the city with water. So the lakes are supplying the city, whose population has increased substantially. Now it becomes a very major city under the British, and its population has increased substantially, and therefore they have to have a lot of these lakes to support people. But what happens in 1888 is the very last lake, which is Sankey Lake, is built, and Colonel Sankey, who builds the lake, says we've run out of place to create any more lakes. Now at this point, Bangalore faces a cusp in history. It could have decided to, the city decides it's running out of water, people are coming into the city, it needs to import some water from outside, and they start with importing water from the Arkavati Basin, which is the lake basin, which I showed you, which is on the western side. Now the cusp is, they were initially planning only to supplement the city's water supply, only for the Indian part of the city. So Bangalore has a very peculiar rule during the British time, during the colonial regime. It's partly cantonment ruled by the British commissioner. It's partly Indian city ruled by the Mysore king. So the Mysore king was extremely interested in new technology and is very progressive and very, very pro-modernization. Decides to import this water through networks of pipes from the Arkavati Basin, which they will pump through. And the idea is only to bring it to certain parts of the city. But then the British asked for it to come to the cantonment part of the city too. And so instead of supplementing the city's water supply, which was local and sustainable, lakes were protected, they were desilted, there were local water goddesses, they were worshipped every year, they were maintained, they were considered sacred, pure, no trash was put in these lakes. Once they replaced the entire water supply with water from outside, within 3-4 years, you can see the language in the archive stage. No longer are these lakes cared for. Trash is dumped into them. They're called malarial cesspools. Even during the plague, people start dumping corpses into the lakes and wells. And which gives you a sense of the extent of defilement, because from the angle of sacred worship, no matter which religion you take in India, Throwing a corpse into a water body is defiling it, making it non-pure. So you might clean it chemically with potassium permanganate and the like, but nobody will ever drink water from that well or use that water from that lake because it has been polluted, right? So the fact that you're throwing corpses into these areas during the time of plague, people wanted to hide corpses because if someone found a corpse and you identified it from the family would be taken away to the plague camp, which is in camp outside the city, and they were scared that the entire family would die. So to hide the corpses, they were throwing them into the lakes and wells. But this is not something they would have done, a few years before when they actually used the water from those areas. So the decline of these lakes started at this time. They continued to plant trees because the city was getting hotter and hotter as more people grew it. But I'll show you if you can go to the next slide. So this is the main street in Bangalore. The Indian part of the city had coconut trees, very useful trees, fruits and flowers and things that were used for worship, largely native. And if you go to the next slide, the British part of the city is largely exotic trees, mostly for shade and beautiful flowers and things that are very ornamental, but very little that was used. Like the Indian side would have mango and tamarind and jackfruit, and the British side would have the rain tree and the tabubuyas and beautiful flowers, but not native and not used in daily life. The next slide. And then we come to 2015, and you can see that there's only one lake in the heart of the city. The rest of the lakes survive in the periphery, but in the heart, all you have is one lake, and that lake, Alsoor Lake, is half of the size. Trees continued to be planted, but by about 2000 onwards, we started losing hundreds of thousands of trees for various infrastructure projects. So we have now this paradox of the city that is growing very fast, facing climate change, but absolutely no attention given to ecological infrastructure because trees are being cut and lakes are being destroyed. The next slide. So as the city got pipe water, lakes and wells became polluted. As the city got hotter, this is in the 19th century, trees were planted. But what happened is a shift. Even now, when we protect the lakes or plant trees, there was a shift in the way people related to nature. As the British colonial regime came in, from an Indian way of thinking of ecosystem to a multifunctional ecosystem use, like I described, the fish, the weeds, the foraging, the agriculture, the sacred use, towards a purely recreational focus or environmental support and ornamental plants. The next slide. So for instance, lakes were used in diverse ways. Livestock was washed and watered. Clothes was washed by the professional launderers called dhobis. Women migrant workers washed the clothes in water. Women foraged at this lake. People worshipped at the lake. Like I said, there were lake goddess worship every year when the lake overflowed. And now, the next slide. These lakes have now become, the village forests they've been, or they've been converted into degraded waste dumps or public utilities or gated parks. This is the conversion that we have. So they're either degraded and polluted, or they converted into these gated parks, often ticketed, so someone needs money to enter, or they have specific timings and you're not allowed to access them during the day. And you're certainly not allowed to access them for fishing or swimming or any other ways of regular use. Next slide. So this is how the rejuvenated lakes look now with the gates, and children who used to play can't play anymore. It's more for bird watching or recreation or jogging or walking. The next slide. Then it's not just the lakes that have changed, it's the cities and the trees that have changed in the way we think of ecosystems. For instance, this is KR Road, one of the largest roads in the city. It used to have wooded streets with vibrant street life. We talked to old street vendors who used to live there. In fact, there was a bamboo weaver colony, which is very well known in this landscape. They used to live on the side of the road, very iconic part of Bangalore. And they used to use so this is a ficus species, and they would use the sap of the species and mix it with one of the millets, the ragi millet, of the night before, and swallow that first thing in the morning, and that, they say, would ward off coughs and colds. Right? So there were multiple uses, a lot of biodiversity in these areas. And now cars have increased. Yeah, next slide. Trees have been cut down. So it's become a high-speed road with very few trees. The trees that are there are ornamental, and the street vendors, whom you can see in the few blue tents, are being resettled because they've lost any capacity to stay without the trees. Trees were very important for basic things like privacy. For instance, the women would change their clothes behind the trees. And without the trees to protect them, they have no way to actually stay in privacy. So lots of little things that we found that the street vendors have their lives so intimately bound with the trees in global south cities. And this is not something anyone ever thinks of when they actually cut down trees on the road. What happens to the vendors? And the vendors are very important, on the other hand, for city dwellers for privacy, because women who come back late at night, when the city is deserted and you feel isolated and there's a likelihood of high crime, if there are street vendors living there, especially families living there, that woman walking on the street feels very safe because not much can happen to her because there are families on the street at night. Right? But this is not something policymakers think of. It's not just there. If you look at the gardens, so here's an example of the botanical gardens, which Hyder built. Lal Bagh, they were botanical gardens, but they had a lot of fruit and ornamental trees. There were also orchards. But now they have become these landscaped gardens. The next slide. Purely recreational, all exotic trees, nothing that is grown that is useful. And again, it's used, it's just extremely water guzzling because a tree park doesn't require so much water, but what this requires is groundwater is pumped, used in tankers and brought to irrigate these lawns, which are very American type lawns, which require a lot of pesticides, herbicides, water, which is ridiculous in summer of the Indian context, right? The next slide. And this also extends into private spaces. So this was a typical Bangalore bungalow. Rich home garden, you can see all the creepers on the front, and these were beans that were grown, they were eaten, flowers that are used for worship on the left, you would see the pink flowers that are used for worship, many plants that are cooked, eaten, used for worship, used for medicines, very rich biodiversity, very high in native species. But now what you find is many of these houses give way to apartments. And the next slide. Apartments have manicured lawns, ornamental plants, coconuts are given way to royal palms, right? And people don't, again, you have the kinds of lawns with the kind of grass that you need to maintain a lot of spray, lots of pesticides, lots of herbicides, lots of water, and no knowledge of indigenous species because the knowledge also goes away. The next slide. Where do you find the last refugees of the original Indian ethos in the city? In fact, in informal settlements and slums, because they have the highest proportion of local species and the highest proportion of useful species. In comparison, if you looked at parks, 80% of the trees in parks are exotic. 70% of the plants in slums, you don't find too many trees in slums because there's not much place. But in paint buckets and battery cans and old plastic sacks and whatever they have at hand, they are growing useful species, which are medicinal plants, which are endemic, which are local, which are high in biodiversity, right? So they are actually the custodians of biodiversity. And the next slide. And then sacred spaces, mosques, churches, temples, graveyards, all faiths have their own species and they're very different species, but all faiths are nature very important. Sacred nature is very important. So you have people feeding ants and birds and protecting roosting sites, and they're very resilient places. This is a Nandi, which is, there's a spring that comes through the mouth of the Nandi, and this entire place was actually buried in Malleshwaram, in a part of Bangalore. And it was going to be built up. And then someone saw that it was always wet and dug in and found this is the origin of one of the springs, which is supposed to feed the Arkavati. Right? So this is just an example with the pigeons, but there are many others of sacred spaces. And sacred spaces, again, have very high biodiversity, which is research of our own that we've shown this. The next slide. So now what can be done? I'm leaving you with a lot of negatives. I should want to leave you with one positive, that what happens in the periphery of the city when water has been a scarce resource is that communities have been coming together to protect water and revive these lakes. Because in the periphery of the city, all hope is not lost because development is now happening and these lakes can be protected. So one of the lakes, Kaikondali Lake, that I was a part of the lake revival along with a large group, was like this when we started in 2006 and 7. And the next slide. It then was restored and maintained by a collaboration between the citizens and the BBMP, which is the municipality. And the next slide. And we now have over 120 species of birds. And Eleanor Ostrom, who won the Economics Nobel Prize, whom I worked with for many years, came shortly before she passed away and planted a jackfruit tree at the site to recognize community efforts through her tree planting. Right? So this is a very well-known lake because of its efforts. And this is the lake after restoration. Yeah, the next one. It's a pocket, it's an oasis in the heart of the city where, like I said, there are over 120 species of birds. And it's really in a very, very dense part of the city. So it really makes a difference in making the city, the wells in the city more recharged, it provides groundwater. The next. We also found, we did a such study with a number of restored lakes, and we looked at about 100 different visitors and users of these lakes. And we found that lakes are very important for place making. See, what global south cities have is a lot of migrants. And when migrants come in, when do they start feeling the city is their own and then start contributing to city urban movements of revival? We found that people come to the lake. It could be a child of the lake, a mother of a differently abled child, a corporate employee, a worker, someone who's transgender. Each of them have a different connection. So transgender people said they like to sit in front of the lake because anywhere in the city, the police show them away. But in front of the lake doesn't judge them. A mother of a differently abled child said that her child comes to one of the lakes to expend energy in the morning and he gets calmer. He feels happy at the lake. She's happy, he's happy, and then he goes to school. And she says, if I don't bring him to the lake, the day is a disaster for the two of us. Corporate employees who work in an IT company the whole day and they're going to be there most of the evening and night too. They come for a break, they bring a flask of tea, they settle down at the lake for a half an hour, mental stress relief, and then they go back, right? And the migrant workers that you see above, they're climate refugees from a different part of the state. But they come, they take a pay cut to work at this lake because just like us, their child is with them most of the day, and they want the child to grow up in a healthy environment. And if they work in, like, say, the building site just opposite where they earn more money, that means the child is in a more dangerous environment and it's breathing all that smoke and dust. And so they would rather have the child grow up in the kind of nature that they grew up in the village, right? So you have the idea that this lake inspires placemaking, and when people meet at the lake, you get to know your neighbors in a fragmented city. And from these meetings at the lake have begun traffic movements to help government school education, movements for waste management, movements for all kinds, of urban sustainability movements have sprung up because people have met at the lake, started feeling this is my place, and taken on environmental stewardship. So this is the new ecological wisdom. While I talked about the old ecological wisdom that is fading away, lakes are still important to restore for a new ecological wisdom. The next slide. And this is something we need to think of because we have bans on urban foraging and we're now viewing these lakes as pure recreational sites where flower plucking is prohibited, damaging plants and trees is prohibited, swimming is prohibited, bringing pets is prohibited, everything that you can think of is prohibited. But the next slide. What we've seen in a recent study of ours is we looked at 200 women from low-income houses, and they knew about 76 different species of wild plants that they foraged or bought. There was a peri-urban gradient. The highest foraging was in the periphery of the city, and only 2% foraged in the city center, but they still went to a local market. They told a woman in the local market what species they wanted, and she would forage in the periphery and bring it back for them the next week. So there's this healthy exchange in forage species going on across the city. And they know about all of these different species, which we don't know about at all. And they know the medicinal uses. This is good for the brain. This is good for the stomach. So indigenous knowledge is massive in these areas. The next slide. It's not just food security. Therefore, it gives you local medicine, nutrition, and traditional knowledge that is passed on through generations that we are completely forgetting in these global south cities with the expansion. The next slide. And so we had for instance, and we looked at this, it's not just in India, but we looked at this study, which is in cities across the world, and we find whether it's Philadelphia or New Orleans or cities in Europe, Stockholm, urban foraging is not legal. It's not defined as legal. Because it's never defined as illegal, but it's not defined as legal. And what that means is the way planners, because it's not talked about at all, people don't think of foraging. And in all of these cities, we find Philadelphia, New Orleans, Stockholm, India, South African cities, foraging is widespread. Doesn't matter whether it's global south or global north. But because it's not defined as legal, most of the foragers are always policed, either put into jail or fined or excluded from foraging. So foraging is always on the margins. It's always being done in the dark in fear of discovery. It's a power game. Marginalized get very affected. And it's just because nobody thinks of foraging, nobody thinks of ecology as wild ecology in the city. They only think of parks as areas of recreation. Nobody thinks of abandoned plots or wood lots or the grass at the verge of the streets as something that is also ecology. The next slide. So here's just a bit of, there's 68% people foraging in cities in South Africa, 47% people forage in cities in Uganda. So it's not just the global South. In New York City parks, you have foraging. More than 75% of the foraging in Philadelphia is in parks. In Stockholm, mushroom foraging and harvesting of berries is very important. And another paper in Berlin talks about 15 different species foraged as food and teas and medicinal herbs. Yet, most city authorities currently frame urban foraging either as an illegal or an undesirable activity. The next slide. So I'll wrap up by saying we need ecologically smart cities. And this is a beautiful slide by an intern, Rohit Rao, who was the one then an undergraduate student who was working on the group that did the foraging research. And this is really an ecologically smart city, which would work in a global south context where you have place for the pigs and the cows, as well as the man with the pram and the man with the cart taking his grass home, the woman foraging, the women selling, the street vendors, the people, the IT workers, the lakes, the parks, everything. It has space for everything. And this is really the global South City. This is the reality of the global South City. So unless we actually think of it this way, we're not going to manage it purely through infrastructure and IT. We have to manage it as ecologically smart cities and pay attention to the way in which nature is used in the cities. The next slide. Yeah, and this is some more of the work that we have, nature in the city, cities and canopies. Next slide. So many leaves, chasing Sopu, where have all our Gundathopes gone, different publications of ours, and all of these are available on the Azim Premji University website. Shades of Blue is another new paper of ours, a new book of ours. Next slide. Yeah. One thing that we found that scientists need to communicate this to policymakers, and sometimes we fail within the city because we've been talking to municipality which is really focused on infrastructure. But we looked at Gundathopes, which are wooded groves, and we wrote a little story, which is a bilingual story in Kannada and English, which is illustrated by our students. And then it turned out that the Panchayat Raj, which works with villages, wanted 6,400 copies for students across rural libraries. But then they issued a government circular that you can see on the right side, which is in Kannada, which essentially says that every village must rejuvenate its wooded groves, which is huge impact. So it's one thing that we realize that we need to be out there communicating a lot of this research. In fact, academics who are doing research on cities, often this stays, and if one stakeholder in the government is not open, there's always another stakeholder who's very open. So for instance, we've been very successful with working with the municipality on lake revival. Not so successful with working with them on tree protection, but we've been very successful in peri-urban areas working on tree protection. So one needs to engage with stakeholders of various kinds, especially the government. And there are always going to be a lot of government officials who are very open to collaboration. And I think academics need to do a lot of co-production with government officers, we're also working with corporate groups, with citizen groups, with resident welfare associations, and we run a number of courses. And this kind of co-production is very important to actually think of sustainable cities. We can't let our research only sit in papers. Right, the next slide. Yeah. So I'll just wrap up saying nature in cities has witnessed rapid change from brown and dusty to blue and green and now gray. But what we see is in urban commons like informal settlements, lakes and sacred spaces, that's where nature thrives. And the idea of nature as a node of environmentalism and placemaking takes us forward to modern cities where you have migration. And this shows us a path forward for ecologically smart cities, which can become nodes of new urban commons. And the science then needs to be taken forward to urban planning and planners. So I'll close here and would be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harini. It was really, really interesting. You have actually taken us through the history of Bangalore. It was really exciting to listen to because I also lived in Bangalore for some time. And now the floor is open for questions. The participants, you can post your questions or you can even ask questions. You can unmute your mic and then ask.
There's
or
one
raise your hand.
Yeah. Do you want to unmute and just ask the question, Ronak?
If you raise your hand, then I can unmute our what. Okay, there is Ronak Sharma. There is a, okay, so he raised.
Yeah, should I read his question out, or Ronak, do you want to read it out yourself?
Yes, good evening, ma'am. Myself, Ronak Sharma. I'm a third year physics honors student from Hindu College, University of Delhi. So my question to you is, ma'am, is that how can Bangalore's past urban planning success and challenges inform current strategies to integrate green urban spaces and sustainable water management into the city's infrastructure, while also adapting to its unique topography and ensuring resilience against future climate changes?
Sure. Very good question, Ronak. So, a few things that we have been seeing is it's important to think of multifunctional ecosystems. We are currently thinking of ecosystems as only one function. I'll give you an example. You plant, we have very little space. We want to plant trees. Okay, you plant trees along the road. We are always thinking of ornamental trees. We need trees that are going to do multiple things. They're going to clean up pollution, so they have to be the kind of trees which have hairy leaves that trap a lot of dust and suspended particulate matter. I didn't talk about it, but our own research shows that trees can reduce sulfur dioxides, nitrous oxides, and suspended particulate matter significantly. So we need those kinds of trees. You also need trees with shade, because we're going to have heat effects in Indian cities, and you need to have, especially migrant workers, people standing in bus stops, people walking along the road. You need the trees to give them the shade, otherwise they're going to collapse on the road, right? So you need large canopy trees. But we are not thinking about food. What would we always plant in India along the roadsides? Tamarind, jackfruit, mango, or ficus trees. And the banyan trees, banyan and people. Banyan and people are very good for biodiversity, but tamarind, mango, jackfruit are also giving you food. So we have to think multifunctionally. So I think that's very important. So for instance, a lake should be accessed by grazers and fishers. If you ask me about traditional wisdom, any expanding global south city will have a problem that sewage infrastructure will not keep pace with the city's expansion. The city will expand, the sewage infrastructure will come 3, 5, 10, 15, 20 years later, right? And what happens in the meantime? Where does the sewage go? It finds its way into the water, because that's the lowest point. People let out the sewage, whether it's an apartment or a set of homes, and it goes into the lowest point, which is the lake. Even if you treat it in a sewage treatment plant, there will still be high in nitrogen and phosphorus, which means a lot of this water in lakes is very biologically enriched, and therefore there's a lot of plant growth. If you leave it like that, the plant growth sucks out the oxygen and all the biodiversity collapses. There's large-scale fish death. When you have cows coming into these lakes with grazers, and the cows are actually eating the grass, you get organic milk, but you also get this extra phosphorus and nitrogen sucked out of the lake in a very natural manner. When we're thinking of modern Indian cities, what the first thing we do is we remove grazers' access, and we say no cows in the lake. But the moment you do that, you're actually harming the lake. So there are many ways. I'm giving you 2 examples with the multifunctionality of trees and the fact that there are cows in the lake. There are lots of more detail that I can go into, but there are things that we can get inspiration from. But this is the reality of Indian cities today, and this is the way ecology always and societies helps us to manage these areas as infrastructure. For instance, parks. We have so many parks, but if we remove the grassy areas that we are again watering at great expense and converted them into weedy areas, most of those weeds are edible. Then you get women from informal settlements to create these weedy areas. They can create workshops. Most of them know how to use these weeds. They can create workshops for people like us. Take us through these 2 foraging exercises. We pluck the weeds, we cook them, and we pay them some money. So you get income generation, you get food, you get organic, you get lifestyle, you get indigenous knowledge and livelihoods. So we have to think like that about how to get this indigenous wisdom and local knowledge and local heritage and history back into our lives with cities.
Thank you, Harini. I hope, Ronak, you got your answer. There's a question from Archana. Archana, you can ask, or you want me to read it? I think I'll read it for you, Harini.
Yeah, sure.
There's a question from Archana in the question and answer session. how we balance urban growth with ecological sustainability in the context of rapidly expanding cities in Global South?
Again, a very important question. So one of the things we need to be doing is to think of how do we plan this growth? Most of our growth is unplanned. And one of the things we need to think of is the peri-urban area. That's where we can actually influence sustainability, as well as in tier 2 and tier 3 cities, or the smaller cities in the global south. For those of you now watching this later who are not from India, tier 2 and tier 3 cities are smaller towns. And where you actually have ecological infrastructure, so to speak, lakes or trees or parks or forests or woodlots or wetlands or grazing areas or grasslands, whatever it is, all of those are really much more in peri-urban areas as well as in these smaller cities. And what you need to first do, therefore, is to have a program to map all of these and say these are no-go spaces, these are inviolate spaces. So urbanization is inevitable. It brings economic progress. It is going to be a path forward for many of these countries. We can debate about whether we should or whether we should not, but the reality is it's going to happen. And so how do we plan it in a way that it has the least impact possible? I think that's the question, because often I get asked, urbanization is not sustainable. Yes, in the big picture, it's not sustainable, but also pragmatically, it's here to take place. And there are many things governments are trying to balance, economic aspirations of citizens being one of them, which are very important. How do you do this? You have to have no-go spaces, which are very strictly implemented. So once you have these mapped and say, don't touch, for instance, one of the things you should never touch in a city is, you can cut down the urban forest if you want, but don't cut down the trees on the side of the road and don't cut down the wetlands. Because the moment you cut down the wetlands, you're having drought and flooding. The moment you cut down the trees on the streets, that's where, again, I said people have to move. Those are the traffics and the conduit of movement. And that's where your heat waves are going to hit people. Right? So those are the kinds of things we need to be thinking of in our planning. And unfortunately, that's what we're exactly doing this. The wetlands are the first place to go because they have absolutely no protection legally in most of these places. Smaller wetlands are gone. And trees on the roads are the second thing to do. Right? So we are actually not protecting at all the areas that we need to protect the most. So that's the way we should be planning our urban infrastructure growth.
Thank you. Is there any more questions?
Hello, Samina. I have one question. Thank you, Dr. Harini, for this excellent talk. I'm Saurabh Sonwani, working as assistant professor in Zakir Hussain Delhi College, University of Delhi. And I'm also a early career representative of iLEAPS. Here I wish to ask that as you have highlighted a very long history of Bangalore, right from the beginning, and considering so many dynasties, including the different kind of the changes into it. So here I wish to ask you that from the beginning till now in the current situation, if we want to learn anything or we can pass on our past knowledge or tribal knowledge to the current scenario. So what you wish to convey to the policy maker, what we can learn from our history?
So I think that's sort of good to know that of your interest in working in these areas. So it's always nice to meet early career people. And I think that's one very nice thing about this iLEAPS series of sessions, as Pallavi was saying. What do we talk to policymakers? I think our Gundatop's work is a very good example of that. These were traditional wooded groves that were always very important part of not just the Bangalore landscape, but the Karnataka landscape. These are wooded groves that have jackfruit, tamarind, and other commercially important species, but also fruiting species. And they were woodlots. They're not sacred forests. There was one sacred tree. There would be a banyan or a peepal, but one sacred tree. But they were really functioning woodlots that the village would get some income out of, but it was also used as grazing lands. And very importantly, as village commons areas and places for shade for community events. So when it was very hot, people would take refuge there during the middle of the day. So that's where people would gather and there was a community place for engagement. Now, the moment we talk to policymakers, like I said, we planned to start with the city, to think that the city needs to be involved. But what we realize, what we fail to think of, that is including myself, is that India is rapidly urbanizing so fast that every village is almost becoming a small town. And so we found across the Panchayat Raj, they were very keen on restoring wooded groves, these wooded tops across the thing. So once that government order comes in, and they're now trying to see if they can try and tie in MNREGA, the Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, to actually restore these wooded tops. We didn't have to tell much to these policy makers, because many of them actually come from rural areas where they have grown up with these wooded tops in mind. So I think we have that window of opportunity, 10, 15 years, when we talk to many of the policy makers, IAS officers, IFS officers, government, municipality commissioners. Many of them come from areas where they have grown up with the knowledge of this ecology. And the moment you tell them about it, they actually are very open to collaboration. So we found a lot of the examples like this. Like I said, if it's not this particular department today, it will be another department tomorrow. And once we try, the good thing is with India, there's a multiplicity of departments working in different planning areas, and there's always somebody who's open to taking some of these directions forward. So I don't know if I hope this answers some of your questions. A lot more depends on the specifics, really.
Moreover, what is your opinion if we are considering the cities like Bangalore, and there are so many other cities within India that they are facing very rapid urbanization, and they are just converting it into concrete structures. So what you wish to convey that because in that way we'll be facing so much of the difficulties related to urban heat island related effects and many more things. So if it is already developed, then what is the way out, how we can cope up or combat with such kind of this situation?
We have to think more innovatively. What if we started a program of rooftop greening, for instance? Because if the roads are gone, the rooftops are there. And we're only thinking of solar, but what if we started rooftop greening or painting we're also thinking of painting roofs white. But if you started gardens on all the rooftops, and Kerala, for instance, has done that in many parts of the smaller towns, then you get urban agriculture, you get incomes, you also get cooling. Right? And we can also think of Indian creepers, which were always there on the walls where people used to get beans. What if you grow them on the side of many buildings to cool them? Right? So we have to think a little more innovatively. We have less space in many of these areas. It is very difficult. You can't tear out very large buildings and restore wetlands. In some areas which are very critical, you'll have to. But the reality is so much has been encroached that it's very difficult to actually take a lot of this out when many people are actually living in these areas and have been living there for many decades. We have to be creative about some of these. For instance, one of the things we've been thinking of is we have modified the topography in so many places, in so many cities. Like I said, we fill in the wetlands and we break down all the hillocks. And then if we want to go back to the original water drainage pattern, we cannot, because the microtopography has been changed. So again, we need very high resolution mapping of microtopographic changes which are current in the city, and then plan drainage patterns. And then look at, do you create underground drainage networks under roads, for instance? We have to do something which is, for the large cities, we have to do something that is a fix. We can't go back to what it was before. For the smaller cities, we have to protect what was there before it's lost. So we have to be thinking very differently about these two kinds of locations.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Thank you for a beautiful answer.
I think there are no more questions. So I think maybe Pallavi, you can conclude. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Harney, for such a wonderful lecture. It's really a ground level approach that you have shared with us on iLEAPS platform. So before I, close this session officially, I want to summarize, or I want to highlight some of the points of the speaker. So Professor Harney has started her talk with the background of urban growth globally, then as an impact of rapid urbanization to different impacts such as pollution, heat island effect, flooding, especially in the underdeveloped and developing countries. Then she mentioned the impact of urbanization on India by adding 400 million people in urban area, facing problems like decline in protected areas, dryness, pollution, and heat island effect. She focused in the Bengaluru city, and that is towards the ecological history of urbanization, and mentioned the change or rise of urban agglomeration from 1537 to 2007. And then she linked it with the decline in natural resources and mentioned the need of urban cities. She has also highlighted the history of Bangalore during 6 to 9 centuries with huge forest cover and with watersheds, and thus it was a sustainable area that was in the Ganga dynasty. Then during the Chola dynasty, people used uh, acclimates. Then during the 13th to 14th centuries, Hoysala dynasty, she mentioned about rainwater harvesting management approach that was utilized for agricultural activities. Then during 14th to 16th centuries, she has explained about the different cost-effective methods and also the cost-effective agriculture activities. Then she talked about the fertile landscape of agriculture supporting by lakes during the 1306 century. Then during 160th century, she mentioned about the different case studies of human-wildlife conflicts. Then she moved to current scenario of Bengaluru and highlighted the change of land use pattern due to so much unplanned construction activities, resulting in flooding and drought problems like conditions in different regions. She has also explained the 1792 view of Bengaluru and explained how the changes took place in tree cover and lake cover from 1792 to 1888. She explained that the tree cover during the 18th century but not basically of the native trees, but some of the exotic trees also. She explained the condition then of 2015 year where tree cover has drastically increased, but there were less lakes and more trees. Then she also explained that with the high-speed roads, which has few trees and the loss of way of life for street vendors. She explained that how the gardens with fruits and ornamental trees are planted and how they have been converted into the purely recreational parks. Then private spaces also experience change from rich home gardens and to apartments with manicured lawns and ornamental plants. She highlighted that slums are some of the areas that have highest population of local species, that is 65%, and highest population of useful species, that is 70%. Then now she explained that what can be done. So the most important takeaway is the lakes can be restored, like she has given the example of Sarjapura Road. Then the lakes have been restored by community participation also. She explained that she has done with interviews of about 100 lake divers visitors and users, which were done to analyze the importance of lakes in a city of Bengaluru. Then she focused the ban on urban foraging, taking nature as a pure recreation site. And the pattern, she has highlighted some of the research papers. That is first paper that is being published in 2021 in the journal Urban Forestry and Urban Greening. That was on the pattern of urban foraging in Bengaluru city. And there they explained this idea on ban on urban foraging and highlighting the nature. Then the another publication that was published in the General Sustainability of MDPI, that was on the on the global perspective, that was on urban foraging, a ubiquitous human practice that is being overlinked by urban planners, policy, and resource. Then she explained that 68% foraging cities in South Africa, 47 for cities in Uganda, and not just for Global South. So she highlighted that we actually need the ecologically smart cities, cities with canopies and so many of lawns. Then there should be the more focus on the community participation of the community management of TOPs and worksheets from school teachers and government circular on rejuvenations of TOPs. Then in conclusion, the main conclusion is the nature survives and thrives in urban commons like informed settlements, lakes, and sacred spaces. And science needs to be taken form to urban planning. So these are some of the highlights. I apologize if I missed some of the points and if I have some misinterpret something because
No, it was very comprehensive. It was perfect.
Thank you very much. So I now officially declare this session to be closed. So this was a very interesting talk, and thank you very much for taking your time out from your busy schedule and enlighten us about this very new topic. And we also like to thank to all the attendees who took the active participation and have an great interaction with our speaker. Last but not the least, iLEAPS and UKCEH for giving us opportunity to conduct this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I'm just closing the session then. Thank you.
Thank you.